Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz, Cohen, speaking to you from my office as Dean of the Pennoni Honors College at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today my guest is the eminent historian, Gordon S. Wood. Dr. Wood is the Alva O. Way University Professor of History Emeritus at Brown University and the author of some 20 books dealing with the American Revolution and its context. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the 2010 National Humanities Medal and the Pulitzer Prize for the Radicalism of the American Revolution. His latest book is Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. This is the second part of a two-part interview. Gordon Wood, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I want to talk about slavery, which shadows the book. And you say that we can't judge the past by the present. And yet, it's very hard not to think about Jefferson, the idealist, with slaves who fathered children by a slave. And even Adams was not as enlightened on this subject as one would have hoped. How do you explain this, if you can, what's your take on this?
Well, I think in case of, there are people who are opposed to slavery, and that's Hamilton, but it's not, there are people even more opposed than Hamilton. And so it is being criticized at the time. In fact, the revolution makes all the difference, makes slavery a problem for the first time in the history of the world.
Right.
The first anti-slave convention is held here in Philadelphia in 1775. That's in the history of the world. So for thousands of years, slavery existed without any substantial criticism. And then all of a sudden, its criticism begins to grow and grows really fast. So within 60, 70 years, the institution's in trouble everywhere.
Right.
So that's one of the great consequences of the American Revolution, that it becomes the entry into this institution to turn it around in ways that we can sort of appreciate today, about the way the culture can kind of flip in its opposition to something. So that's
where I guess that fits your notion that the revolution has more importance than any of the men or their particular ideas. It had an idealism attached to it that would affect so much.
The culture transcends the individuals who make up they scarcely know what's happening in many cases.
Right.
We don't really, in fact, we live in a fog, that's my view. So it's only historians looking back can make sense of the disorder of the world they're living in. But slavery was being criticized. Adams takes towards Jefferson. Now, privately, he said, look, I never owned a slave, and I don't like the institution. Abigail's even more opposed to it. But he doesn't want to say this too strongly to Jefferson. What he does say is, look, I'll leave you guys to solve, you guys, meaning the planters of the South, to solve it. Because who am I to tell you what to do? You've got this monkey on your back, and how are you going to solve the problem? How are you going to solve it? And I leave it up to you. That's the view he took. Maybe not the right view, because these people, for the most part, weren't going to be able to solve it. And then, in fact, they begin turning inward, including Jefferson. Now, Jefferson's courageous because as a young man, he speaks out against it, against slavery. This took courage because none of his colleagues are doing that. And so this is, I think, a major thing for him to become and he's got so much support in his Virginia society that they put up with this radical in their midst.
He had capital.
Well, he's just someone who they respected.
When I was growing up in school, we learned about the American Revolution as an uninflected war for freedom over tyranny. But the more I've learned about it, the more complex the situation becomes. Not only do we have the issue of slavery and these founders many of them having slaves, but the issue of the Native Americans. What strikes me also is that America had such a high economic profile. We were prosperous as a nation. And perhaps slavery would have ended sooner had we remained with England. And the English might have protected the Native Americans. I mean, these are things that I was struck by when I went to the Museum of the American Revolution that I had not fully filtered.
Well, that's absolutely right. And probably the slaves would have been better off remaining under the empire.
Under the king, yeah.
Because the English abolished slavery in their colonies in 1834. And presumably, well, it would have created a crisis in North America if they'd done that. If we'd remained and they worked towards abolishing slavery, that would have created the revolution right then and there, at least for the southern colonies. So that's true. And the native peoples, well, they were supported by because they wanted to keep the white folk out, and because the interests of fur trading and so on.
Right.
But there were different interests. There were also interests in England that wanted white folk to spread out, because then they purchased English goods. So you had different interests at play. It's not at all clear that the English would have. They couldn't stop it anyhow, because the whites were just expanding westward. There was no way you could stop this demographic imperialism, if you will. And that's what, in fact, the Spanish faced that. They realized they would lose Florida, they would lose New Orleans and Louisiana. That's why they were forced to give up these territories, simply because the English colonists, British colonists, were expanding into the areas, and there was no stopping them. Demographically, they were just being overrun.
But the revolution itself was so much about, getting back to the beginning of our interview, about ideas, and the fact that these ideas could be so powerful that they would trump, moderate prosperity, and that you could get people to fight for ideas.
Well,
even ideas that weren't consistent with what was actually going on.
Freedom is sort of, what's the freedom? Oh, my freedom to make money, or the freedom to do what I want to do.
To be outside the yoke of the king.
And there are examples that you can find in a New England village where the man says, look, I want freedom to trade with the West Indies, and the Brits are stopping me from doing that.
Right.
So this is what I'm fighting for. He might not say it just as openly, but that's what freedom meant to him.
Yeah.
So you have examples of that. But liberty, freedom were the catchwords that they used, and had brought all kinds of meaning to a lot of maybe selfish interests. Certainly there are economic and selfish interests involved in the colonists' revolution. But it is extraordinary, because the white portion of the colonists, and that is the dominant portion, is experiencing the highest standard of living of any place in the world, with the possible exception of some parts of Scandinavia. So the revolution is always a puzzle for historians. How do you get a revolution from people who are really very well off? And that has always caused a problem.
But I think it connects also to your notion, of which Jefferson helped to promote, of American exceptionalism, the ability of wanting to be free in whatever form, whether selfish or otherwise, that is really at the center of what the American character,
because we had developed over the previous 2 centuries, or century and a half of colonial, a very unusual society that lacked hereditary aristocrats, which is unusual compared to Europe. I mean, Europe is always the standard.
Yeah.
So we have a society which is relatively egalitarian, not equal, completely equal, but compared to Europe, yes.
Yeah.
And Jefferson is stunned to see how unequal France is. So you have that sense of differentness, which becomes the exceptionalism. We are already prepared for republicanism, because republic requires a relatively equal society. So that's the sense that Americans have, that they're primed, so to speak, for republicanism, or we would call it democracy, and we're prepared for it socially. So we're ready. We're in advance of England. All of a sudden, they had been always regarded as being inferior to the English or the European standard. All of a sudden, you have this kind of change in your mentality. You say, well, we're not inferior. We're superior. We're ahead of Europe. We're in the vanguard of history, leading the world toward a republican future. Now, it looked bad.
We can begin the world again.
That's right. They say, now it takes a long time, because Lincoln is still fighting that. You know, the revolutions of 1848 had all failed. They were revolutions in Europe to overthrow monarchy. They all failed. There's one in France and one in Italy, one in Germany. They all are put down. And so when Lincoln says we are the last best hope, he's talking in that context. It really isn't until our own, well, the 20th century that we begin to see the fulfillment, and maybe not until 1989, 1990, that you begin to see the fulfillment of that original vision. Now we still have it. I mean, there's still a sense that the world will become all democratic sooner or later. There is that feeling, and that certainly is a Jeffersonian feeling.
I am fascinated by the fact that John Adams hated Hamilton, we've already discussed, but he also hated Benjamin Franklin. Explain that to me.
Well, Franklin was a very shrewd and diplomat. He's over there as a diplomat, trying to extract money from the French government. Franklin was by far more savvy about the court and how to deal with the French than Adams. Adams is a New England Puritan, if you will. He's appalled at the French behavior with their mistresses and so on. And he just couldn't, he and Abigail were just stunned by that. And Franklin was lazy. He seemed lazy. He didn't show up for meetings. He was always slow. He was always at his dinner. And Adams sees himself doing all the work, and Franklin's getting all the credit. And that just
riled him.
It just riled him. It irritated him to no end. And he felt that he was kowtowing to the French. Now, we have to understand, we needed the French money, and we needed the French army. Franklin knew what he was doing. He was the best diplomat we've ever had. He extracted loan after loan from a government, a French government that was impoverishing itself. I mean, he set the money that they lent us set the stage for their own revolution, a financial crisis in France. Yeah. So he's doing all this, and he finally gets the French to send troops, large numbers of troops that really made a difference. I mean, Yorktown was a French victory. Right. So Adams is saying, you're spending too much time paying attention to the French. He challenges the French and says things to them to the point where Vergennes, who was the French chief minister, says, I will not speak to that man again. Get him out. And this is what led...
So he didn't recognize what Franklin was doing?
No, he never fully appreciated what
now,
Franklin was doing.
Adams had such a sense of injured merit. That seems to have been one of the driving forces. He was a very ambitious man. But he had some sort of wound.
Well, he's a vain. He knows that. He's obsessed by vanity, and he wants to be recognized. And so it's a real fault, I think, and people knew it. And he was so ridiculous at times that people openly mocked him.
And yet he was, if I were to say, reading your book, who I would want to go to dinner with, it would be Adams.
If you got to know him, he could be, as people who did get to know him, he could be the most amiable. You'd love him. You'd fall in love with him because he just would be so friendly and so open. He just would, he had that kind of personality.
Open and vulnerable.
Right.
Yes, which is a very endearing quality.
And lacking in dissimulation.
Yeah.
You always knew where you stood with him. He wasn't going to stab you in the back.
And a loyal friend in many ways.
Oh, definitely. And so that people who grew to know him loved him. And I think Jefferson came to appreciate that. Madison never understood what Jefferson saw in Adams. See, he just didn't know Adams that well. Yeah. But Adams was more important. I think one point we should always make is that he's more important for our constitutional structure than even James Madison. The federal government takes the form it does because of Adams. Adams created the Massachusetts Constitution. Yeah. He created the notion of separation of powers in his Thoughts on Government, which is the most important pamphlet he wrote in 1776, which affected or influenced constitution makers. And then when he writes the Massachusetts Constitution with a strong executive who he wanted an absolute veto, but his colleagues wouldn't go that far, but they give him a limited veto. Most of our governors today, as far as I know, all of them have a limited veto. And the president has a limited veto. It's Adams who created that. And the Senate, a strong Senate, separation of power, a strong independent judiciary, those are Adams's points. So he needs to be recognized for his
And these
constitution.
were wonderful intellectual as well as political ideas.
Well, he had a very antiquated notion of social orders that got him into trouble with his colleagues. They never quite understood what he was talking about.
He didn't believe all men were created equal.
That also, that's
Yes.
right. He took on every single American myth and dream. All men are created equal? No, they're all created unequal. American exceptionalism? No, that's crazy. We're just as sinful and vicious as other nations. So he's not someone who speaks up for the greatness of America. He loved America, but he says we're making a mistake if we think we're better or different from other nations. And that, in that sense, he takes on all. He's a realist, the ultimate realist. And I'm not sure that the country wants or can bear having having that kind of realism thrown in its face, that all men are created unequal. In other words, nature is all important and not nurture. He says education can't change it. Americans don't want to believe that. We really want to believe in education. And I think rightly so. Even if Adams may be right, he may be right in some sense, but not to let us, to ignore education would be a terrible thing.
As you had mentioned, there was this long period in which the two of them were
12 years.
12 years, alienated from each other. It
right.
looked hopeless. Benjamin Rush, who was a physician, was the intermediary and brought them back together again. I find that a very sort of romantic story.
Right, it is.
And what was it about Rush, who is unsung in many ways?
He is, and people here in Philadelphia ought to be honoring him because he's a Philadelphia man. I mean, he's a Pennsylvanian. He is a second-tier revolutionary, and yet there's no good biography of Benjamin Rush. No full biography. He is kind of crazy, though, as a physician. He believed in bleeding.
But that was done then.
Yes, but he miscalculated the amount of blood in the human
so
body.
He would kill people.
He thought there were 12 quarts when in fact there were only about 6, and sometimes he would take out 5 quarts over 2 days, and he lost a lot of patients. But anyway, he was beloved by Adams. Adams came to, Rush was a Republican, supported Jefferson in the election, but he loved Adams, and so he's close at Adams. They get reconciled in 1805, and they exchange letters. Those letters, many of them have been published. Rush knew Adams better than he knew Jefferson, but he did correspond with both. But it's natural for Rush to he just really loved Adams. Even though Adams would say all these things that would flabbergast, he was getting a rise out of
What
Rush.
do you think it was about Adams that would get certain people, I mean, others loathed him, or could, as you say, Madison couldn't understand at all the Jefferson's liking for Adams. But what was it about Adams? Was it this this frankness? This
well, he likes to razz people. He's facetious. He makes jokes. He'll say outrageous things just to see what's the reaction of somebody he trusts. And he would say things to Rush, and he would love to see Rush's response, because Rush is kind of a straight man. What? You think that, mister? I mean, that's the kind of... And even when the reconciliation occurs to Jefferson, Jefferson's so polite, never says anything that's going to get a rise out of Adams. Right. But Adams would constantly say to him, well, no, this is 1815. Napoleon's been defeated. The Bourbons are back on the throne in France. And so what does Adams say to him? So, Mr. Jefferson, what do you think of the French Revolution now? I mean,
he had to rub it in.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
And Jefferson would not come back. He just put up with this kind of razzing. Anyone else might have said, enough is enough, I'm not going to write to this guy again.
Right.
But Jefferson puts up with it because he values the relationship and the exchange, even though Adams writes 3 letters to every one of Jefferson's.
Well, he was in so much more... Was the word conscientious?
He had
less time. But also he was an obsessive, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote all those letters to Jefferson, and sometimes wouldn't get a response.
Sometimes, he'd go on 6 in a row, and then Jefferson was so embarrassed, he would say, well, I'm sorry, I haven't answered, I've been busy. I've got a lot of correspondence. That's when Adams said to him, well, how many do you have? And he had, 10 times as many, 2,000 something in 1 year compared to his 200. And so he appreciated, he says, don't you worry about it. He says, I love to write, I'm happy. Don't you feel guilty. He wanted to assure him that he enjoyed.
So let me ask you a question. Of the two men, which would you most want to meet?
Oh, Adams. By far.
Really? Okay.
Oh,
yeah. That came through in the book, even though you ended with, we honor Jefferson.
I mean, I think that we honor Jefferson for reasons that haven't to do with their personalities. It has to do with what Jefferson stands for, that declaration, which, of course, when he wrote it, had neither of them had any idea it could be so important.
Right.
That's what really bothers Adams later when he finds that Jefferson taking all this credit for the Declaration.
But the eloquence that Jefferson had, which was part of his grace.
Right.
And
He's a
in a
graceful
way,
writer.
I mean, I don't want to use the word superficial because it has such a negative connotation, but the surface grace that Jefferson had and which Adams could never have,
No.
but which made him so much more interesting.
Yes,
To
Adams.
sit across, if we were sitting across.
No, if you had a
from-
dinner party, you'd
Yes.
want to have Adams there because he'd be
Yeah.
full of life and saying things, provocative things, and you just.
And they'd be shouting and laughing, and everyone would, yes,
he
it would
would
be fun.
razzing people and so
Yeah.
on. If he were in company that he was
Comfortable with,
right, comfortable with, right. Whereas Jefferson would never that. He'd be polite, always polite, and you'd never know what he's really thinking.
These two men died on the same day, July 4th, right? And July 4th, no less. And you almost feel
1826, 50 years to the day of the Declaration. 50 years,
50
the Jubilee
years
celebration.
to the day. And you feel that they did this through force of will.
Well, there is some element.
Talk about that.
Well,
Could that possibly be?
Well, yeah, they know they're dying, and Jefferson says to his doctor, "Is it the 4th yet?" And he says, "No, it's only the 3rd." He says, "Oh," he hangs
Hold on.
right, and he hangs on, and they certainly did will it. And Adams wakes up, and they say, "Mr. Adams, you know what day it is?" And he says, "It's the great 4th of July," and yet he's passing away, and he says, Jefferson still survives, but Jefferson has died
dead.
5 hours earlier. He doesn't know
yes.
that. But in some larger sense, of course, Jefferson does survive.
Oh, symbolically,
Yeah,
yes.
symbolically, he doesn't. I mean,
Yeah.
really, how many people, until recently, people didn't know Adams at all. It's only, I think, David McCullough's biography that suddenly he made some impact on the country. But,
That's absolutely true.
but until then, he was virtually,
was
except
forgotten.
outside of Quincy, Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Historical Society, most people didn't know much about Adams at all.
And Abigail, too, who was an
That's right.
extraordinary woman.
Right, and
Yeah,
now her
absolutely.
letters have been
Yes.
published in the Library of America as well.
That's
So
right.
she's the only, that's really interesting, a
Yeah.
founder's wife.
Yes.
Because the others, they burned them. Jefferson burned his letters with his wife, Martha, and
that
then
so?
Martha Washington, when George died, she burned all his
That's so
letters. They just
interesting.
thought these were private affairs and shouldn't be made public. But fortunately, Abigail and John did not burn their letters, and that we have over 1,200
Well, there was so
of
much
them.
substance
Well,
in their
that's
letters.
right. They were not
Yeah.
ordinary letters.
His relationship with Abigail Adams, fascinating. That they had
John,
this-
you're talking about?
Now I'm talking about Jefferson.
Oh, okay,
yes,
that's right.
now I'm talking, of course, we know about the Abigail Adams and her
Right,
husband, but Jefferson and Abigail Adams had this very wonderful friendship correspondence for a while.
When they were in ministers or abroad in Europe, first they were together in France, and then when Adams and the two Adamses go off to London to be minister to London, there's correspondence between Paris, because Jefferson remains as minister to Paris, and he's corresponding with Abigail and flirting with her.
Flirting with her.
Well, that's right.
And she was flirting with him.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he at one point he says, "Well, I was going to buy a little statue for the dining room table, for the dining room of Venus." He said, "But I thought 2 Venuses in the same room would be too much." That kind of comment. It's by today's standards pretty tame stuff, but they really did fall in love with one another, the two families.
And what did she say? Remember the ladies.
Yes, very important.
Yeah.
A little exaggeration for our own time, but
Yeah.
still she was well ahead of many other women at the time.
Absolutely. I want to, because we don't have that much time, I want to quote the last lines of your book, where you write, "To be an American is not to be someone, but to believe in something." And that something is what Jefferson declared. That's why we honor Jefferson and not Adams. That's a very interesting way to end the book. And I mean, it's clear that you were trying to, you're wrestling with the fact of these two men and the fact that Jefferson embodied something. And so that's something that you're talking about. We have to believe in something. It's not someone, but believing in something. Can you elaborate as we
Well,
move
it's the
toward a
Declaration
close?
of Independence. All men are created equal. A very powerful statement.
Yes.
That's what Lincoln grabs hold of. And he uses it to justify his opposition to the South and to the extension of slavery. And he's the one who really rescues Jefferson. He says, all honor to Jefferson. And he makes Jefferson the hero. And that's why Jefferson is celebrated in a way that Adams is not. He has, Monticello is a World Heritage Site, visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. I mean, how many people go to see John Adams's house? It's very hard to get to in Quincy, and it's a national. It's run by the National Park Service, but it's not in the same league with Monticello. Yeah, they really are two different men. It's amazing that they were friends at all.
Well, thank you again for being with us, Gordon Wood. The men came alive for me through your book.
I'm glad.
They absolutely did, and I think for our audience too, through this interview. And I really want to thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And thank you for being here today as well at the Drexel interview.